With more, joining us live from Sydney is Bob Carr. He was Foreign Minister in the Gillard government. Prior to that, he was the Premier of New South Wales for a decade. Bob Carr, appreciate your time. Thank you. What is your analysis of the AUKUS agreement? Do you share any of the concerns that have been raised by the Teals there and other Labor luminaries in recent days?
Yeah, I think the government's going to work harder, as it will have to, at explaining some of the concerns. It seems that only a year ago we were talking about costs of $50 billion over the life of the contract, and that seemed very disturbingly high. Now we're talking about $368 billion, and that is almost inconceivable as being possible without a very heavy abandonment of other defence opportunities. I think the government's got to engage with critics and explain that the opportunity cost in defence procurements elsewhere is not going to be represent a sacrifice for one capability. And there are serious critics with the knowledge of defence matters who think this is too much money for a limited capability when you consider opportunity cost, like, for example, and it's only one example, having a couple of score of Sons of Collins class submarines.
Are you satisfied that Australia can retain its sovereignty under this deal, that our independence in the event of a conflict is rock solid?
I don't think there's any doubt that our American allies, our American cousins, in their joyful acceptance of Australia's commitment, Australia's huge commitment, have got an expectation that in a war between the US and China, the odds are now that Australia would be there on day one. Our previous position under coalition and Labor governments in respect of Taiwan is that we retain strategic ambiguity. Alexander Downer even said explicitly in 2004, AUKUS would not apply to a showdown in the Taiwan Strait. Now that strategic ambiguity is keeping Australia's options open. Peter Dutton rewrote that when he said late 2022 that in November 21, Peter Dutton said it's inconceivable Australia wouldn't be there if the United States was at war with China. Now that hasn't been the traditional coalition or Labor government approach. And I think a lot of people will want an assurance that we are not going to plunge into what would be a ruinous war between China and the US, one that incidentally is very likely to leave America, our ally, seriously weakened and wounded. Australia, just make this point quickly, Australia, if it sent vessels, naval vessels, up into the first island zone, the first island chain, within the first island chain, would have to have a high expectation. We'd have to have a high expectation that they would be expeditiously sunk. There are defence experts in Canberra who believe not one of Australia's naval vessels has got protection against surface skinning Chinese ballistic missiles. In the past, when we've gone to war with America, it's been against mobilised peasants, goat herds in Afghanistan, peasants recruited out of the villages of Vietnam, a peasant insurgency in Iraq. This would be the first time we went to war, of course, with a nuclear power, and in a zone in which China has got dominance of the air. Any suggestion that the Americans have that we are in this from day one, regardless of the circumstances, and because of AUKUS, should be quietly but unmistakably ruled out by an Australian Prime Minister.
So what would that mean for us on home soil, Bob Carr? You wrote a piece last weekend in which you imagined a national security meeting where the Prime Minister expresses that Australia really has no choice but to back in America in the event of that sort of conflict that you were just alluding to there in the Taiwan Strait. If we carry on from your imagining and look at that scenario in a conflict, how convinced are you that any US-China conflict would become a nuclear exchange? And you wrote about major powers using so-called surrogate targets in conflict. What could that mean for Australia?
Well, we can only speculate about the lineaments of a war between the US and China, but I think experts are united in saying it has got a less than trivial chance of becoming a nuclear exchange. In a nuclear exchange, it could be attractive to America's adversary not to strike the American homeland, but to make a message about striking American assets on someone else's soil or an American communication facility. I think even ASPI, which is totally wedded to the American view of the world, really an American think tank in Australia, even ASPI has said there would be defence assets in northern Australia likely to be targeted for Chinese missiles, and in a nuclear exchange it is a horrific prospect for Australia to contemplate. This is very serious. It is war between nuclear powers. It is war between great powers, something we haven't seen since 1945. I just plead with my colleagues in Canberra to make sure Australia is always reinforcing, down to the last comma, the strategic ambiguity, the diplomatic formula that we have used about Taiwan in the past. It is not inconceivable that Australia not go to war with China at the side of the US. That's the language of Peter Dutton. We should never give a hint of automaticity about Australia's involvement in a war between the US and China. We are a sovereign nation, and even the former head of AUKUS, our overseas intelligence gathering arm, said in his retirement speech in November last year, don't assume Australia is automatically involved on the American side in a war between the US and China. That I think Penny Wong has been quite punctilious when there's been some blow-up over Taiwan, for example, during the provocative Pelosi visit last year, quite punctilious in stating the Australian position, in not giving any encouragement to Americans who've sounded like they want to shift the red lines, including, I regret to say, President Biden, who on 3 occasions now has stumbled into making a commitment to Taiwan. Previous US presidents were careful not to do that. It makes it all the more important that we choose our language very, very carefully and settle on a diplomatic formula that for 70 years has preserved the peace. Penny Wong's choice of language is being careful, but I want to encourage the government to stick to that caution.
Bob, as you know, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese insists Australia will retain its sovereignty through this deal. Paul Keating was accused after his National Press Club address of doing China's bidding when he raised several concerns about this deal. You too have faced similar assertions from some quarters over the years. The former Prime Minister was also roundly criticised over downplaying the threat we face from China. How do you characterise the threat China poses to Australia at this point?
Well, I don't see a threat to Australia. Where is the threat to Australia in China's assertiveness, for example, in the South China Sea, where China has behaved very much as America has behaved in the Caribbean, in its surrounds? I think we've got to be forceful with China. I think we've got to say to China that were there to be a military showdown initiated by them over Taiwan, that Australia would be at the forefront of Western nations in applying very damaging economic and diplomatic sanctions. And this would be hurtful to China, as Western sanctions applied to Russia have been to Putin. I think we've got to have a very candid dialogue with China maintain that dialogue about aspects of Chinese behaviour. But this careless talk of Chinese aggression, when what people really mean is the assertiveness of a rising power, very often in response to suggestions of China being isolated or contained by the West, is dangerous talk, because as some of the more aggressive people, including people in Canberra, pitch their argument, we're creating a sense of the inevitability of war. And 1914 should have taught us that to say anything that suggests the inevitability of conflict simply becomes a terrifying, self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we've got to dial back war talk on both sides, and I'm not convinced there's been more of it from China than there's been from the West. If you take literally some of the things that US senators have said, we are on the path to war, or some retired US generals and admirals.
Bob Carr, we are running out of time, but it would be remiss of me as a former New South Wales Premier in the studio not to ask you about your view of this weekend's election in the state. What is your expectation of the outcome? If Labor wins, what sort of Premier do you think Chris Minns will be?
I think he'll be an outstanding Premier. The election is a test, it's the ultimate test of political leadership, and his performance has been absolutely immaculate. There's not a criticism, I think, could be made of the way he sold Labor's policies and campaigned across the state. I think Labor's going to win. There might be just a question mark over whether they get a majority in their own right, but that you'll have a Labor government after Saturday, I don't think is in doubt.
Bob Carr, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us with your views. Appreciate it.